Thank you so much. And feel free to sit. It's just actually I'm sharing some more memories of Jim that were sent in by colleagues who couldn't be here and some who just wanted to add a few thoughts. So let me go ahead and read a few of these, if I may. The first is from Marvinzonas, Professor Emeritus at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. And here's what Marvin has to say. In the good old days, way back in the 1960s, Jim and I were the only political scientists doing research in Iran. And they were the good old Iran days, before the boom in oil revenues and before the domestic and foreign plagues brought by all that money sloshing around Iran. Tehran was calm and manageable, an overgrown village. A taxi ride anywhere in the city cost about 25 cents. There was a flourishing black market in real Iranian caviar, so that even we graduate students could afford it. Something similar happened in the Soviet studies field, by the way. But the best news was that Tehranis couldn't really figure out what Jim and I were up to. We were both aspiring political scientists. Quote, but surely you're kidding. Are you journalists or maybe CIA spies? Unquote. Whatever they believed, we were such novelties that we could get access to whomever we wished to interview. That was the upside. The downside was that pretty much anyone we told about studying Iranian politics besides our academic advisors thought we were out of our minds. The standard response was something like, if Iran disappeared from the face of the earth, no one would notice, so why are you bothering? Well, it turned out that disappear from the face of the earth was the farthest possibility from what actually happened. In short, Jim and I really lucked out, in on the ground floor, as it were. We met in Tehran and became colleagues in the struggle to understand the superficially placid politics of Iran. Of course, it did not take long to appreciate that placid was irrelevant to Iranian reality. More to the point, were very messy sets of shifting alliances and commitments, starting at the top and going all the way down. Jim understood Iranian reality very quickly and wrote his path-breaking book on webs, what these days we would call social network analysis, the mapping and measuring of relationships and flows between people and groups. That set us up not only as colleagues, but also as competitors. Who was going to be the Iran politics expert when there were very few of us who knew anything about Iran and yet could speak English? Well, it turned out that the rivalry rapidly disappeared. There was room far more than for the two of us. As the saying goes, Iran produced and continues to produce more history than it can consume. So there were lots of opportunities. Jim and I, and occasionally his beloved wife Anne, were together at the big events of the 1970s. We lived it up at the most luxurious conference I have ever attended, and I imagine Jim felt the same way. The academic part of the 2,500th anniversary celebration of the founding of the Iranian monarchy. A shady interpretation of Iranian history, for sure, but a great experience at Persepolis. We really hit our stride during the Iranian Revolution. We both traveled to Iran to try to read developments as the revolution unfolded. We even had the opportunity for a joint private audience with the Empress when things looked very bad for the Pahlavis. We tried to assess what the Shah and Empress thought they were doing. I at least tried to suggest steps they might try to take to preserve the monarchy. Jim and I were regular guests on the major TV broadcasts. We were together on a Dan Rather CBS news broadcast where we agreed that the monarchy was doomed. But we really got busy on TV when the Iranians seized the U.S. embassy and held American citizens captive for 444 days. Neither of us were fans of the clerics and the repressive and regressive regime. Jim went on to write more about Iran, about his favorite diplomat, and about U.S. foreign policy. He created a distinguished academic career and was a builder of a great organization at William & Mary. I went in a different direction. But my memories of Jim as a young and vibrant and brilliant scholar are as vivid today as they were when we first met in that ever-fascinating and ever-stimulating Tehran of the 1960s. I also have reminiscence from Paul Thanos, Global Trade and Investment Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Paul writes, it would be an understatement for me to state that Dr. James Bill had a profound impact on my life and career. I was one of the lucky students from the class of 1989 who took Dr. Bill's first Middle East politics class at William & Mary. Through a combination of charisma, facts, humor, and compassion, he explained a narrative of U.S. policy in the Middle East, and particularly U.S.-Iran relations, that kept me both spellbound and informed as a student eager for information and to learn. He became one of my most important mentors at William & Mary, and when I graduated to soon take a position at the International Trade Administration's Middle East office in Washington, D.C., with a focus on Iran and Israel-Palestine conflict, his influence and mentoring only grew in importance. One of the highlights of my early career was consulting with Dr. Bill on all issues in the Middle East and getting a reality check on what was and was not working in the U.S. government's approach to Iran at that time. He also shared with me his great joy and also the challenges in the early days of ramping up the Reeve Center, his legacy at William & Mary. He was so supportive of my career path, and I am thankful that I was able to get to know Dr. Bill and Mrs. Bill much better after I graduated from William & Mary. One of my favorite memories is serving as a guest lecturer during several of his Middle East politics classes in the 90s and early 2000s, and then going with him to lunch at Barrett's to talk about baseball, politics, Iran, and life. I consider myself extremely fortunate to have known Dr. Bill and to have learned from him. He represented the best in American education, and the burden is on all of us to ensure that his vision for the Reeve Center and critical thinking will continue to affect lives at William & Mary. The next one is from Augustus Norton, who, of course, couldn't make it to the first panel, but was very, very sad. By the way, everyone on the first panel who couldn't make it was deeply regretful of that, and I think have written to Anne as well to express their sadness, but they're with us in spirit. And Augustus writes, Richard, I am disappointed to miss this important opportunity to honor the scholarship of James A. Bill, who was my friend, confidant, and mentor. He was also a model of scholarly achievement. Jim's inspiring scholarship on Iran was rooted in hard-earned fluency in Persian, mastery of Iranian history and politics, a knowledge of Iranian society and culture that could only be acquired through feet-on-the-ground field work. While Jim's renown as a scholar grew out of his seminal work on the politics of Iran, he was also a master of comparative politics, as exemplified in Comparative Politics: Quest for a Theory, which we co-authored with Robert Hargrave. The book remains a model of lucid thinking and engaged writing. The same may be said of the Popular Politics of the Middle East, which went through a number of editions and was co-authored initially with Carl Leiden and later with Robert Springborg. Jim's masterwork was certainly The Eagle and the Lion, which not only provides the authoritative account of U.S.-Iran relations, but also offers a detailed, pull-no-punches account of the U.S. elites who fostered, shepherded, and protected the Shah's privileged relationship with the U.S. Although Jim was stalked by Parkinson's disease in his last decades, his scholarship continued to blossom in retirement. I point to two worthy works, his provocative and insightful comparison of Shia Islam and Catholicism, which he wrote with John Williams, and not least his study of George Ball. Ball was a remarkable public intellectual and official who was well known for his dissent to U.S. policy in Vietnam, as well as his hard-headed and perceptive assessment of the troubled U.S. relationship with Israel. Jim enjoyed complete access to George Ball's personal papers and archives, and his book stirs each of us to consider the importance of informed dissent, especially in the highest reaches of government. Jim himself was a man of strong moral conscience, which is evident in his scholarship and his advice to the powerful. I continue to admire his judicious critiques of U.S. policy in the Middle East. Jim was also a sportsman. He loved baseball, and he was, as I am, a devoted fan of the Chicago Cubs. It pleases me to imagine Jim cheering as the Cubs finally, will it happen, finally winning the World Series in the 10th inning of the 7th game last autumn. Jim was also hooked on fishing, a true bass master, perhaps only rivaled by Ann Bill, his loving and incredibly devoted life mate and boat mate. I cannot conclude without noting that Jim was a highly competitive fisherman, which is to say that when we fished together, I never had to count my catch. Jim would always know with precision how many crappies, perch, or beloved largemouths I had yanked in. I enjoyed ribbing him about that. More seriously, I miss Jim Bill's scholarly presence, his humor, and his counsel profoundly. Go Cubs. Finally, last one is short, and that's from Monty Palmer, again, who couldn't make it this morning. He just wrote, Jim Bill personified both scholarship and friendship. My life and my career are richer because of him. He set the standard for all of us. So this is the moment for anyone else who'd like to take the microphone and say a few words. I don't know if anyone would like to start, please.
For those of you who don't recognize me, I am Tim Bill, son of Jim. I've been accused of resembling him since I was a young child, and this used to bother me a lot in junior high and high school, but I've gotten used to it by now. When I was living in Iran as a child, I was referred to as Bilche, which I believe means little shovel. My family and I live in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and interestingly, the only way I can be here today is that an Iranian physician has offered to operate on one of my patients tonight for me. James Bill, James Alvin Bill, Professor Bill, Dr. Bill, Jim, Jimmy, Dad, Grandpa, all of you know him by one of those names. To me, he was just Dad. The personal and academic tributes that have been discussed today mean a lot to our family, and we really appreciate it. I don't have a long talk to give you, as most all of you knew my dad well on a professional basis. I will just provide a few anecdotes about him from outside of academics to demonstrate the type of man that he was prior to his illness. As a parent myself, if I've been at least half the father he was, I would consider it an accomplishment. I will also touch on his horrible Parkinson's disease. Dad was never afraid to tackle a project, and fortunately he never took himself too seriously. While he excelled in the classroom, he was not very handy around the house. One of my earliest memories of him trying to fix our sprinkler system in the yard. I was about 4 years old and distinctly remember kneeling down and watching him for about an hour. After watching him sweat and say a few words I did not yet understand, I said, "Dad, don't you think we should get somebody in?" And he looked at me and said, "Great idea, Timmy," and we went back inside. Similarly, he was convinced that he was a great car mechanic, although he couldn't even change his own oil. We would spend hours looking under the hood of Old Blue, our 1965 Ford Galaxy 500, trying to come up for a reason why it did not start. Typically, the attempted solution was a hammer and a few choice words. Most commonly, however, the malfunction was because it was out of gas, because the fuel gauge never worked. The exhaust system was broken and unfortunately vented directly beneath the car. When we would come to an intersection, smoke would envelop Old Blue. On more than one occasion, neighboring cars would approach us and let us know that our car was on fire. We would just smile and nod. As has just been mentioned, my dad was an avid fisherman. When he first got his diagnosis of Parkinson's disease, he would make an effort to get out to the lake every day after teaching. He was also quite good at fishing, although given our competitive nature, my mom and I would argue that we were superior. One year when Dad, his brother, and I were at our cabin in Wisconsin, he broke 3 ribs after falling in the boat. He insisted that a few broken ribs would not stop him from fishing, and with a little bit of help from ibuprofen and Jim Beam, he fished for another week without a single complaint. He always prided himself on being an outdoorsman. One year at our cabin, he decided that the two of us would find Lost Lake. This was rumored to be a lake in the middle of nowhere in Iron County, which is a lot north of Sauk County, which he was convinced was full of huge fish. The only way to get to the lake was to cross a much larger lake and then portage the canoe several miles. Dad insisted on having his line in the water in order to begin fishing the minute we left the shore. On this particular trip, he imparted his infamous words of wisdom. "Timmy, you never, and I mean never, stand up in a canoe." Unfortunately, he did not abide by his own advice, and he stood up the first time he got a snag. In less than a second, all of our gear was lost, and both of us were underwater. We never found Lost Lake, but we did lose a lot of fishing equipment in dozens of lakes over the years. I mentioned the competitive nature of our family, and he was always tops along those lines. Even when I was in college, he would routinely make a list of activities that he knew he could beat me in, from such activities as football to badminton to jacks. Not that we ever played those games against each other, although I'm sure that if we did, I would have crushed him. As you can see, I unfortunately got that gene from him. Dad was a powerful advocate for Rebecca and me. He was convinced that we were the absolute best in every activity that we participated in, and this was also his expectation of us. This ranged from always getting an A in school to always winning in athletics. My mom, on the other hand, always said, "Tim, just do the best you can." Fortunately, there was always her calming voice when I did not win a race, game, or event. As young as 4th grade, I realized his expectations when I received an average grade on a standardized test. Dad was convinced the grading system was flawed, so he paid for me to retake the test at a later date. One year in high school, I was in a cross-country race. Near the end, I was barely in first place. Dad always had his video camera with him. He started running next to me to tape the event. His words on the tape were, "I don't think Timmy can do it. I don't think Timmy can do it. I don't think Timmy can do it." Then he ran into a fence with the camera running. Later after the race, he made me dub over it. It certainly would have been a hit on America's Funniest Videos. As important as this tribute is to my dad is acknowledging my mom, Saint Anne as most consider her. This speech would not be complete without mentioning that Parkinson's disease is horrible. With retrospect, he lived with Parkinson's for 25 years, and for nearly a decade, my mom learned what it was to be a full-time caretaker. Of the last 25 years, Dad had dementia for at least 10 years and severe dementia for at least 5 years. He was an incredibly difficult person to care for. When his dementia set in, he was dangerously impulsive, irrational, and very hard to deal with. I know this personally because I spent 2 weekends with him so that my mother could have a couple of days break. It was a 24-hour-a-day, full-time job and exhausting. I could not imagine being in her position for a week or much less years. Mom was imprisoned by his disease. She could not leave Dad alone even for a few minutes at a time without a potential disaster. Despite hundreds of horrific falls, he fortunately never had a severe fracture. Mom missed out on countless milestones of her grandchildren because of Parkinson's disease and her dedication to Dad. Mom, you are a very special person, and Rebecca and I are enjoying seeing you more frequently, both at our houses and in Williamsburg. Thank you.
In slightly different perspective in relation to the origins of the Reeves Centre. I met Jim when I came to interview for a job at William and Mary back in 1989. And of course, as you're all telling us, you immediately become friends with him. And we worked together, and in his last year at the Reeves Centre, he asked me to go there just for the one academic year to help with a project. But in our many conversations, once he told me this interesting piece. Standard story is that Wendy Reeves gave the money, the Reeves Centre was established, Jim came to run it. Jim didn't remember it like that. For Jim, what had happened is a contact had been made by Frank Schatz with Wendy Reeves, and it looked as if she was very interested in establishing a Reeves Centre. But she hadn't given the money. But Jim was appointed, and he met her, and there was a conversation there where they talked about setting up a Reeves Centre. And then when it got to the money angle, Wendy, and this is all hearsay, that's what I've heard from Jim, Wendy said, oh, well, I'll go to some of my friends and see if we can put something together. At which point, Jim, in his impish way, said, Emery Reeves was far too great a man to share this project with other people. And the $3 million was handed over, not in a brown bag or anything, but, so the standard story is that he was sort of handed it on a plate, and he wasn't. He was very much part of establishing the whole thing and getting it going. And as somebody alluded to, he was really rather good at raising money. And the first time he did that here was, of course, with Mrs. Reeves. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for setting the record straight. I have heard that version of the story from Frank, too, so I think it's not just a version, but the correct version. Well, I think, we also have a reception outside. We have some wine and, nice snacks for people to just converse and talk and reflect a little bit more. So unless anyone else is moved, I have to say, for me, it's been profoundly moving. And again, I feel so blessed to be in the position I'm in that Jim created. Jim created this whole center. He changed the way William and Mary operates. He affected the field. He affected the intellectual side, the policy side. This is an amazing legacy. It truly is. And I just want to thank once again the Bill family for coming and the various people who've helped to make this possible today. So thanks so much for coming.